Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. In this series, I've been looking at a number of powerful and popular endgame unique items, and while some of them have been at the more eclectic end, like Garb of the Ephemeral, today I want to talk about Cinderswallow Urn, which is one of the most popular flasks in the game for a very good reason. So Cinderswallow Urn is an item that is very easy to misinterpret the power of, because it has one line of text on it that is, broadly speaking, pretty bad for a lot of builds. And that's the first line. Recharges one charge when you consume an ignited corpse. Now, for some builds, yes, that's a genuine benefit, but most builds will think, that doesn't apply to me. And then it's very easy to just sort of, you have your mind turn off. You've seen that mod that doesn't help you, and then you just sort of forget that the rest of the mods on this item are actually really, really, really good. So, don't make that mistake. I underestimated this flask the first time I saw it when it was added back in the Betrayal League, and don't make the same mistake I did. So, the other thing to note about Cinderswallow Urn is that one of the mods on it, and you'll see that the very bottom one, suffix mod of the order, is 8 to 12% movement, increased movement speed during Flask effect, and 50% chance to avoid stuns during Flask effect. This is not the only thing you can have in that mod slot. Essentially, this is 5 or 6 different flasks. That mod can be different. However, when it actually drops, it will drop with a veiled mod on it. And this is the only way that by looting Cinderswallow Urn and then unveiling it, this is the only way that you can learn those crafts, and you can then apply them to your other flasks as well. So if I wanted to, I could apply that mod of the order to just a random magic flask that I had. Say if I wanted to put it on a jade flask, I could do that. However, there's a few different possibilities there. The two most popular ones are the hybrid move speed anti-stun that you see on this flask, and also another mod that increases your critical strike chance while you're under the flask effect. And the critical strike chance is a little bit less powerful than having 2 power charges on your character. 2 power charges is still okay. So those are the two most popular mods you can have there, but there are other mods, and you should consider all of the possibilities. So let's go through the other mods on this. Firstly, we have that recharges 1 charge when you consume an ignited corpse. We've already mentioned this. Doesn't do anything for most builds. If it does for your build, fantastic. The flask is probably still good anyway, even without it. The next thing that's easy to notice is the actual effect that is intrinsic to it being a silver flask, and that is that it grants Onslaught when you use it. Onslaught is 20% attack, cast, and movement speed. Very powerful effect. And so that alone makes the flask, maybe not quite compelling to use on its own, but in conjunction with everything else, it's great. Next, there's what I term the recovery stats. So this is the 3rd, 4th, and 5th stats that you see on this item. Recover 1 to 3% of life, mana, and energy shield, all as separate rolls, when you kill an enemy during Flask effect. This may not sound like all that much. You're thinking, 4,187 life, 729 energy shield. Is it really that big a deal that I'm recovering 120 life and 15 energy shield when I kill a monster? Actually, yes. This feels super passive. This flask lasts for a full 6 seconds at 20 quality, and if you upgrade it further to 28 quality, then you're looking at 6.4 seconds. That's quite a while. During that time, while in regular mapping, you're going to kill a lot of monsters. Often enough to have your 40 charges back, and during that time, it's effectively recovering your entire life pool. But the other thing that's really important is that this is a source of life recovery, or energy shield if you're an energy shield build, that actually doesn't care about the fact that you might hit full life. If you have a slow life flask that grants the same amount of life recovery per second, but then you hit full life, that flask turns off. You don't get any more of it. However, with Cinderswallow Urn, it keeps recovering your life the whole time. The other thing is it's also recovering mana, which is just really good quality of life. I wouldn't necessarily call it a massive power boost, but in a lot of cases, because if you need a mana flask to to sustain your skill, then you're not going to have access to Cinderswallow Urn's full power when you're fighting a map boss. But it does mean that you probably don't need to hit your mana flask if you're using one during your mapping. And also, a lot of builds don't necessarily just go whack, 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 whack on bosses. So those builds may also find that this is the only mana flask that they need. Lastly, There's this mod, enemies ignited by you during Flask effect take 10% increased damage. This is very, very, very easy to underestimate. This might seem like, oh, I'm not playing an Ignite build, I don't care about it. That's the wrong way to think about it, because it's very easy to ignite monsters. Even if you're not trying to scale the Ignite damage, all you need to do is hit them with a critical strike that deals fire damage. It only needs to do 1 or 2 fire damage, and boom, they're ignited. This then means that the enemy is taking 10% increased damage. This is not 10% increased damage to your character, like for instance a passive node that says you deal 10% increased elemental damage. This is 10% increased damage that monster takes. That means that it stacks in the same layer as effects like shock, and it's extremely, extremely strong. In a lot of cases, it's like just a 10% more multiplier on damage that just doesn't apply to your first hit. It's also very, very, very good on damage over time builds, where it can be quite hard to find sources of this increased damage stacking layer. So ultimately, that's the reason Cinderswallow Urn is so good. How do you go about getting it? The answer is simple. You need to kill the Syndicate Mastermind. So it is a Katarina exclusive drop. So you will need to engage with the betrayal system and Jun's missions inside maps, run enough of them, and eventually you will fill up the intelligence meter for the Syndicate Mastermind. You then need to go and fight the Syndicate Mastermind in her hideout, and when you defeat her, there's a number of unique items that she can drop. One of them is Cinderswallow Urn. It's not a particularly rare drop. You will see it quite a bit, and it also only takes about maybe 8 or 9 Syndicate missions to spawn Katarina, so you should be able to get this pretty reliably in solo self-found. Ultimately, it's just simply one of the best items in the game for a lot of builds. If you're playing a critical strike build, Bottled Faith is probably the best flask in the game for you, but the second best flask is probably Cinderswallow Urn. If you're playing a damage over time build, Cinderswallow Urn is probably the best flask in the game. And ultimately, there are not many builds that should not use this flask. Really, the only time I would say you do not want to use this flask is if you're playing some sort of build that is actually incapable of dealing fire damage. So, for instance, if you are using the unique weapon Cold Iron Point, Cold Iron Point grants tremendous damage to your physical spell skills, but also prevents you from dealing any elemental damage on your character, then that's the sort of build that will not benefit from this flask. Likewise, if you're playing a pure damage over time build, then you may not be able to get benefit from this. Otherwise, though, I think it's something that's worthwhile seeking out on pretty much every character. And ultimately, in terms of the final mod, you can potentially just unveil one, hopefully you'll find the one you want, but if you don't, the flask is still pretty good. You can use it and then try and run another Katarina and hopefully get the exact mod that you want on the flask. Lastly, this can be a pretty expensive item in trade leagues because it's deterministically farmable, but early in the league, there's so much demand for it. There's no one that really loots Cinderswallow Urn by accident early in a league. So do expect that if you're going to trade for this in the first 2 weeks of a trade league, be willing to pay many hundreds of Chaos Orbs for it, because it is not a cheap item. However, if that's too much, by all means, just go and farm it yourself. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away down below. This series on Endgame unique items is something I'm intending to continue. There's going to be a link popping up on the screen about now, showing you the rest of the series. But otherwise, may your Val Orbs have interesting results.